In the vast expanse of the Galactic Council chambers, where species from 1,000 worlds gathered to shape the fate of civilizations, one moment of careless cruelty would teach an entire empire what it truly meant to cross a human. Princess Zarth of the Veltar dynasty had never met a human before that fateful day. She had heard the stories, of course, whispered tales of the strange bipedal creatures from a backwater world called Earth, being so primitive they still fought wars over patches of dirt and drops of liquid fuel. What she hadn't expected was to discover that sometimes the most devastating response to an insult isn't anger or violence. It's the terrible, crushing weight of indifference from someone who could have been your greatest ally. Some lessons are learned through pain, others through loss, but the hardest lessons are learned when you realize you've thrown away something irreplaceable, and the universe will never give you a second chance to make it right. Commander Marcus Chun adjusted his dress uniform one final time as the transport shuttle descended toward the massive space station that served as the Galactic Council's headquarters. Through the viewport, he could see the impressive structure rotating slowly against the backdrop of stars, a testament to the engineering capabilities of dozens of species working together. At 32 years old, Marcus had already seen more combat than most soldiers experience in a lifetime, but this diplomatic mission felt more daunting than any battlefield he had ever faced. The Terran Federation had been granted membership in the Galactic Council only 3 years ago, after humanity's unexpected victory in the Corvan border wars had proven that Earth's military was not to be underestimated. Despite their technological disadvantages, human forces had demonstrated tactical brilliance and an unbreakable will to fight that had impressed even the most warlike species in the galaxy. Now, humanity was being invited to participate in the Council's most prestigious event, the Centennial Peace Summit, where young representatives from major civilizations would discuss trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and potential military alliances. Marcus had been chosen for this honor not just because of his military record, but because of his doctorate in xenocultural studies. He spoke 17 alien languages fluently and had spent years studying the customs and traditions of various species. The Federation's leaders believed that someone with this combination of martial prowess and diplomatic knowledge would best represent humanity's interests while avoiding the cultural missteps that had derailed previous negotiations. As the shuttle docked with the station, Marcus reviewed his mission parameters one final time. He was to attend the formal reception, participate in the 3-day conference sessions, and, most importantly, identify potential allies among the younger generation of alien nobility and military leaders. Intelligence reports suggested that several species were interested in establishing closer ties with humanity, particularly after witnessing human innovation in military tactics and technology. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and Marcus stepped into the station's main receiving area. The artificial gravity was set to galactic standard, slightly lighter than Earth's, making his movements feel more fluid than usual. The atmosphere was a carefully balanced mixture that could be breathed safely by most oxygen-breathing species, though he noticed the slight metallic taste that indicated the presence of trace gases favored by silicon-based life forms. The receiving hall was impressive beyond description. The ceiling stretched up nearly 50 meters, decorated with a stunning mural that depicted the founding of the Galactic Council 2,000 years ago. Beings of every conceivable shape and size moved through the space, some humanoid, others utterly alien. Marcus spotted a delegation of crystalline Zephyrians, their bodies refracting the station's lights into beautiful prismatic patterns. Near them, a group of insectoid hive speakers communicated through complex pheromone exchanges that created visible clouds of colored gas around their forms. A tall, elegant figure approached Marcus. The being stood nearly 3 meters high, with pale blue skin and for arms, each ending in delicate, finger-like appendages. This was clearly a member of the Altarian Diplomatic Corps, known throughout the galaxy for their skill in managing interspecies relations. Commander Chun, the Altarian, spoke in perfect English, its voice carrying the melodic quality typical of its species. I am Ambassador Kethvar, your assigned liaison during your stay. The Federation's representative is punctual, as always. We appreciate this quality in humans. Marcus inclined his head respectfully. Ambassador Kethvar, thank you for the warm welcome. I'm honored to be here representing humanity. Indeed, Your species has made quite an impression in recent years. Come, let me escort you to your quarters so you may prepare for tonight's reception. Many important individuals are eager to meet you. Kethvar gestured with two of his arms toward a series of corridors that branched off from the main hall. As they walked, the ambassador provided a running commentary on the various species they encountered. Marcus made mental notes about everything, which beings seemed friendly, which appeared aloof, and which showed any signs of hostility toward the human presence. Most seemed merely curious, though a few gave him what could only be described as dismissive glances. The reception tonight will be interesting, Kethvar said as they entered a transit pod that would take them to the residential section. Many of the younger representatives are eager to prove themselves to their elders. Some may test you, Commander Chen. How you respond could significantly impact humanity's future relationships. Marcus nodded. I understand, Ambassador. I've studied the cultural protocols extensively. Is there anyone in particular I should be aware of? Kethvar's expression became thoughtful. Princess Zurath of the Veltar dynasty will be attending. She is spirited, young, brilliant, but perhaps too quick to judge. Her species values strength above all else, and they have little patience for what they perceive as weakness. The Veltar Empire controls 17 star systems and maintains one of the galaxy's most powerful fleets. An alliance with them would be tremendously beneficial for humanity. And they're interested in such an alliance? Marcus asked. Perhaps. Emperor Thakron has spoken favorably of human military tactics. However, his daughter has expressed reservations about your species. She believes humans are too primitive, too emotional. Tonight may be your only chance to change her mind. They arrived at Marcus's quarters, which were spacious and well-appointed. The room featured a large viewport looking out at the stars, a comfortable sleeping area adjusted for human physiology, and a workstation with access to the station's vast information networks. Everything had been designed to make him feel welcome while providing the resources he might need during his stay. The reception begins in 3 hours, Kethvar informed him. Formal attire is required, though I see you have come prepared. One final piece of advice, Commander, among the young nobles attending tonight, reputation is everything. They have grown up hearing legends of their ancestors' great deeds. Try to find common ground, but do not appear weak. The galaxy respects strength. After the ambassador left, Marcus spent time reviewing detailed files on each of the major attendees expected at the reception. Princess Zarath's profile was particularly interesting. At 26 years old, she had already distinguished herself as both a scholar and a warrior. She held advanced degrees in military strategy and xenobiology from the Veltar Imperial Academy, and had served as a combat officer during the recent Nexus Rebellion, where she had personally led boarding actions against enemy vessels. The Veltar were humanoid, but significantly larger than humans, averaging nearly 2.5 meters in height. Their society was built around concepts of honor, strength, and martial prowess. They had a rigid caste system, with warriors at the top and scholars, merchants, and laborers arranged below them in descending order of respect. The royal family was expected to excel in both intellectual and physical pursuits, and Princess Zarath had apparently exceeded all expectations in both areas. According to the intelligence reports, she was also known for her sharp tongue and quick temper. Several diplomatic incidents had been attributed to her tendency to speak before thinking, though her father had always managed to smooth over any resulting problems. The reports suggested she had little respect for species she considered inferior, and, unfortunately, humans appear to fall into that category in her mind. Marcus changed into his dress uniform, checking every detail carefully. The dark blue fabric was adorned with the insignia of his rank and the medals he had earned during his military service. The silver star gleamed on his chest, a reminder of the day he had held a defensive position single-handedly for 6 hours against overwhelming odds, allowing his unit to evacuate wounded comrades. Beside it, the combat infantry badge marked him as someone who had faced enemy fire and emerged victorious. As he prepared to leave for the reception, Marcus reflected on the weight of responsibility he carried. This wasn't just about making a good impression. The future relationship between humanity and some of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations could depend on how well he performed tonight. No pressure at all. The reception hall was even more impressive than the receiving area had been. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across walls decorated with artwork from hundreds of different worlds. Tables laden with foods suitable for various species' digestive systems lined the perimeter, while the center of the room provided space for socializing and dancing to music that somehow managed to appeal to beings with wildly different auditory systems. Marcus entered the hall and immediately noticed how conversations seemed to pause as various beings turned to look at him. He was probably the only human in attendance, making him something of a curiosity. He straightened his shoulders and moved into the crowd with confidence, remembering Kethvar's advice about the importance of appearing strong. The first hour passed pleasantly enough. Marcus found himself in conversations with young representatives from a dozen different species, discussing everything from trade opportunities to cultural exchanges. Many expressed genuine interest in learning more about humanity, particularly about Earth's military capabilities and technological innovations. A few were clearly testing him, asking pointed questions about human weaknesses or making subtle challenges to see how he would respond. Throughout it all, Marcus remained diplomatic but firm, neither backing down from difficult questions nor responding with hostility to obvious provocations. He shared stories of human achievements while acknowledging areas where other species had superior capabilities. The approach seemed to be working. Several representatives appeared genuinely impressed by his combination of confidence and humility. It was during a conversation with a young Corvan general about innovative battle tactics that Marcus first noticed her. Princess Zertich stood near the far end of the hall, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers and advisors. Even among the diverse assembly of beings present, she commanded attention. She was tall, even by Veltar standards, probably close to 2 3/4 meters in height. Her skin had the characteristic silver-blue tone of her species, and intricate tattoos in darker blue trace patterns along her arms and neck, markings that indicated both her royal status and her military achievements. Her hair was long and white, braided with small crystals that caught the light when she moved. She wore a formal military uniform that somehow managed to be both functional and elegant, with a ceremonial sword at her side that was clearly much more than mere decoration. But it was her eyes that really caught Marcus's attention. They were large and violet, with an intelligence that seemed to miss nothing. As she conversed with those around her, her gaze occasionally swept across the room, cataloging everything and everyone present. When her eyes briefly met his across the crowded hall, Marcus felt a strange moment of connection, as if they were taking each other's measure. He was making his way through the crowd toward her when he was intercepted by Ambassador Kethvar. "Commander, how are you finding the reception?" the Altarian asked. "Quite enlightening, Ambassador. I've had some very productive conversations." "Excellent. I believe now might be an appropriate time for you to meet Princess Zarath. She has been observing you throughout the evening." Kethvar led Marcus through the crowd toward where the princess stood. As they approached, her advisors seemed to melt away, leaving her standing alone. Up close, she was even more impressive, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself with absolute confidence and authority. "Your Highness," Kethvar said with a deep bow, "may I present Commander Marcus Chun of the Terran Federation." Marcus executed what he hoped was an appropriate formal bow, having studied Veltar customs extensively. "Your Highness, it is an honor to meet you." Princess Zarath looked him up and down with those violet eyes, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, with a slight accent typical of her species. "So, this is humanity's great warrior," she said, and there was something in her tone that made Marcus immediately wary. "I have heard many stories about your kind, Commander Chen. They say humans are cunning fighters, that you defeated our mutual enemies through cleverness rather than strength. We prefer to think of it as adaptation, Your Highness. Human forces were outnumbered and outgunned, so we had to find other advantages. Yes, I have read the battle reports. Quite interesting tactics." She paused, still studying him intently. "Tell me, Commander, is it true that humans still fight wars over access to water?" The question caught Marcus off guard, both because of its directness and because of the slight mockery he detected in her voice. Some conflicts on Earth have involved disputes over natural resources. Yes. As our population has grown, competition for essential materials has sometimes led to tensions. How primitive, she said, and now the disdain in her voice was unmistakable. The Veltar mastered stellar engineering 2,000 years ago. We move planets to suit our needs, rather than fighting over the scraps nature provides. But I suppose when one comes from such a limited background, one must make do with what one has. Marcus felt a flash of anger, but kept his expression neutral. Around them, other conversations had begun to quiet as beings noticed the exchange between the human commander and the Veltar princess. Every species has had to start somewhere, Your Highness. The Veltar Empire's achievements are indeed impressive. I understand your people have made remarkable advances in military technology as well. Oh yes, our warriors are quite capable. We value strength, you see, both physical and mental strength. We believe that true nobility comes from proving oneself in combat, from facing one's enemies directly rather than hiding behind tricks and clever strategies. The insult was subtle, but clear. She was suggesting that human military victories were somehow less honorable because they relied on tactics rather than brute force. Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself that losing his temper would accomplish nothing. I can respect that philosophy, Your Highness, though I would suggest that different approaches to warfare can be equally valid. After all, the goal is victory and protecting one's people, not necessarily adhering to a particular code of honor. How very practical, she said, and the words sounded almost dirty in her mouth. But then, I suppose when one species is still struggling to master its own planet, one cannot afford the luxury of honor. The insult was becoming more direct, and Marcus could see that other beings around them were listening intently. This was clearly some sort of test, though whether she was testing him personally or humanity as a whole remained unclear. Humanity has certainly faced challenges, Marcus replied carefully. But we've also accomplished things that many thought impossible. Our recent military successes suggest that we're perhaps not as limited as some might assume. Princess Zarath laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to be both beautiful and cutting. Oh yes, your recent victories. Quite impressive for a species so young. Though I understand you suffered significant casualties in those campaigns. Such a waste of life. Of course, when one's people are expendable, I suppose such losses are acceptable. That did it. The suggestion that humans were expendable, that their lives had less value than those of other species, crossed a line that Marcus could not ignore. But even as anger flared in his chest, he remembered his training, his mission, and the consequences of losing control in this moment. Instead of responding with anger, Marcus did something that clearly surprised everyone present, including the princess herself. He smiled, not a mocking smile, but something sadder and infinitely more complex. I see, he said quietly. Thank you for clarifying your position, Your Highness. It has been educational. And then, without another word, he turned and began walking away. The silence that followed was deafening. In Veltar culture, walking away from royalty without being dismissed was an enormous breach of protocol. But more than that, Marcus's calm response had somehow turned the princess's insults back on her. By refusing to engage with her provocation, by simply acknowledging her words and leaving, he had made her look petty and cruel in front of everyone present. Commander Chun, she called after him, and for the first time that evening, there was uncertainty in her voice. But Marcus did not stop, did not turn around, did not acknowledge her words. He walked steadily through the crowd, which parted before him like water. Conversations resumed in hurried whispers as beings tried to process what they had just witnessed. The human had been insulted by one of the galaxy's most powerful princesses, and his response had been nothing. No anger, no counter-attack, no diplomatique manœuvre. Just a quiet acknowledgement and withdrawal. As Marcus reached the exit, he heard Kethvar calling his name, but he continued walking. He needed air, space, time to think. The reception continued behind him, but something fundamental had just changed, not just in his own mission, but in the complex web of relationships that govern galactic politics. In his quarters an hour later, Marcus sat staring out at the stars, and wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his diplomatic career, or if sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty was simply to refuse to participate in it. He had no way of knowing that across the station, Princess Zarth was staring out of her own viewport, replaying their conversation over and over in her mind, and beginning to realize that she might have just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Princess Zarth paced the length of her luxurious quarters, her long stride eating up the distance between the viewport and the door in just a few steps. The reception had ended 3 hours ago, but sleep remained elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Commander Chen's face, not angry, not hurt, but somehow disappointed. That expression haunted her more than any curse or threat could have. The quarters assigned to Veltar royalty were among the finest on the station, befitting their empire status as one of the council's founding members. Holographic artwork from her homeworld decorated the walls, displaying scenes of towering crystal cities and the vast purple oceans of Veltar Prime. The furniture was scaled for her species' height, and the atmospheric controls had been adjusted to provide the slightly higher oxygen content that her people preferred. But none of these comforts could ease the growing unrest in her mind. She had insulted beings before. It was practically a royal prerogative among the Veltar, where verbal dueling was considered both an art form and a test of character. Usually, the targets either responded with anger, which she could easily counter, or with fear, which proved they were unworthy of respect. Commander Chun had done neither, and his unexpected response had left her feeling somehow diminished. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication. Zarth activated the holographic display, and the imposing figure of her father, Emperor Thakron, materialized before her. Even in hologram form, he radiated the kind of presence that had allowed him to unite 17 star systems under Veltar rule. His silver-blue skin bore the intricate tattoos of a warrior king, and his violet eyes, so similar to her own, held the wisdom of someone who had ruled for over 2 centuries. "Daughter," he said, his deep voice carrying both affection and concern. "I have been receiving interesting reports about tonight's reception." Zarth straightened, automatically falling into the formal posture expected when addressing the Emperor, even though they were alone. "Father, I assume you've heard about my encounter with a human commander." Indeed, Ambassador Kethvar was quite detailed in his report. He suggested that your conversation with Commander Chun was less than diplomatic. The princess felt her cheeks flush darker blue, a sign of embarrassment among her kind. The human was weak, father. He had no response to legitimate criticism of his species' limitations. When faced with truth, he simply walked away like a coward. Emperor Thakron was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face with those penetrating eyes. "Tell me exactly what you said to him." Reluctantly, Zarth recounted the conversation, though she found herself editing some of her harsher comments. Even so, by the time she finished, her father's expression had grown increasingly grim. "Zarth," he said quietly, and the use of her full name rather than an endearment told her she was in serious trouble. "Do you understand what you have done? I exposed the weakness of a primitive species that seeks to play among civilized races. Surely that serves our empire's interests. You insulted a decorated war hero who was sent here as an honored guest, representing a species that has recently proven itself capable of defeating enemies that gave even our own forces significant trouble. And you did so publicly in a manner that reflected poorly not just on yourself, but on our entire civilization." The Emperor's hologram began pacing, a sure sign of his agitation. "Zarth, you're not some minor noble who can afford to make enemies for sport. You are my heir, and someday you will need allies throughout the galaxy. The humans may seem primitive to you now, but they are advancing rapidly. More importantly, they have something that many of our traditional allies lack. What could these humans possibly have that we need? Innovation, adaptability, the willingness to find new solutions to old problems. Our intelligence reports on their recent military campaigns show tactical brilliance that impressed even our own war leaders. They took forces that were inferior in every measurable way and found methods to achieve victory that no one had considered before." Zarth felt a flicker of uncertainty, but her pride drove her to continue arguing. Tricks and deception's father. Hardly the hallmarks of a truly strong species. Is victory not the ultimate measure of strength? The Emperor stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that made her feel like a child again. You speak of our values, daughter, but you seem to have forgotten one of the most important: respect for worthy opponents. The humans may fight differently than we do, but they fight effectively. That alone should have earned them your respect, not your contempt. The princess opened her mouth to respond, but her father held up a hand for silence. There is something else you should know. 3 days ago, I received a communication from Admiral Rextar of our Fourth Fleet. He had been reading human military manuals that were recently made available through cultural exchange programs. He was so impressed by their strategic innovations that he has requested permission to implement several human-developed tactics in our own training programs. This information hit Zarth like a physical blow. Admiral Rextar was one of the Veltar Empire's most respected military leaders, a war hero whose tactical genius was legendary throughout the galaxy. The idea that he would voluntarily adopt strategies developed by the species she had just dismissed as primitive was almost impossible to process. That cannot be accurate, she said weakly. I can forward you his full report if you wish. The humans call it asymmetric warfare, using your enemy's strengths against them, finding advantages in places where none appear to exist, adapting faster than your opponent can respond. Rextar believes these concepts could revolutionize our approach to military campaigns. The Emperor's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained stern. You have always been brilliant, Zarth, but brilliance without wisdom is merely another form of stupidity. You allowed your preconceptions to blind you to the true nature of the being you were speaking with. Do you even know anything about Commander Chun beyond the fact that he is human? I reviewed his basic file. He is a military officer with some academic credentials. His basic file does not mention that he holds a doctorate in xenocultural studies and speaks 17 galactic languages fluently. It does not mention that he personally held a defensive position for 6 hours against overwhelming odds to save the lives of his subordinates. It does not mention that he has written 3 academic papers on interspecies diplomatic protocol that are considered required reading at the Galactic Institute. With each revelation, Zarth felt her certainty crumbling. Why was I not told these details? Because you did not ask. You made assumptions based on species prejudice rather than individual merit. This is not worthy of a Veltar princess, and it is certainly not worthy of a future empress. The communication link crackled slightly as the Emperor leaned forward. There's more, daughter. Word of tonight's incident is already spreading through diplomatic channels. By tomorrow, every major species will know that the heir to the Veltar throne publicly insulted humanity's representative. Some will see this as confirmation that our empire looks down upon newer council members. Others will question your judgment and fitness to rule. Father, you will fix this, he said, cutting off her protest. I do not know how, but you will find a way to repair the damage you have done. The future of our empire's relationships may depend on it. The hologram flickered and disappeared, leaving Zarth alone with her thoughts and a growing sense of dread. She moved to her private terminal and began accessing more detailed files on Commander Chun and humanity in general. As she read, her horror at her own behavior grew exponentially. The man she had insulted was not some primitive warrior, but a scholar soldier whose accomplishments would have been impressive by any species standards. His doctoral thesis on conflict resolution through cultural understanding had been cited in over 300 academic papers. His military record showed not just courage, but genuine concern for the welfare of those under his command. During the Battle of Kepler Station, he had personally led a rescue mission to save civilians trapped in a collapsing habitat section, risking his own life to ensure that non-combatants could be evacuated safely. But it was the personal details that really drove home how badly she had misjudged him. Chun had grown up in poverty on Earth, the son of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to pay for his education. Despite facing significant hardships, he had excelled academically while also serving in his planet's military forces. He had used his own prize money from academic competitions to fund scholarships for other disadvantaged students. This was not a weak man. This was someone who had faced adversity throughout his life and had consistently chosen to respond with determination rather than bitterness, with service rather than selfishness. And she had called his people expendable. Zaratich slumped in her chair, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her error. She had not just insulted an individual. She had attacked the fundamental dignity of his entire species, and had done so in front of representatives from dozens of other civilizations. The worst part was his response. Another being might have challenged her to combat, or launched into an angry defense of their species' honor. Either reaction would have allowed her to save face by responding in kind. But Commander Chen had simply acknowledged her insult and walked away, leaving her looking like nothing more than a bully who picked on those who couldn't fight back. Except, as she was now learning, Ika fought back. His academic credentials alone would have allowed him to verbally dissect her arguments with surgical precision. His military record would have given him ample ammunition to question her own combat experience, which, while respectable, paled in comparison to his achievements. Instead, he had chosen dignity over confrontation, grace over aggression. He had made her look small without saying a word in his own defense. A new chime indicated another incoming communication. This one was from her military advisor, General Vexhai, whose scarred face appeared in the holographic display. "Princess," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I have been monitoring communications traffic throughout the station. There are developments you should be aware of." "What kind of developments?" "Several species representatives have been requesting private meetings with Commander Chen. The Altarian Trade Confederation wishes to discuss mining rights in human territory. The Corvin Republic is interested in joint military exercises. Most significantly, the Zephyrian Collective, which has never shown interest in newer council species, has formally invited humanity to participate in their advanced technology exchange program." Each piece of information felt like another blow to Zaratich's confidence. "They are courting the humans because of tonight?" "Partially, yes. Your public treatment of Commander Chen appears to have generated sympathy for humanity among several key delegations. But, more importantly, it seems that many representatives have been quietly impressed by his conduct. His refusal to respond to provocation with aggression is being interpreted as a sign of advanced diplomatic maturity." General Vexhai paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "Princess, there are also rumors that several species are reconsidering their planned negotiations with our empire. The hegemony of Tau Ceti has postponed their scheduled trade discussions. The Centauran Alliance has canceled tomorrow's military cooperation meeting. Because of one conversation? Because of what that conversation revealed about Veltar attitudes toward newer species. Princess, our empire has always prided itself on honor and strength. But tonight, you appear to demonstrate neither. Honor does not attack those who cannot defend themselves. Strength does not need to diminish others to prove itself." The general's words stung because they were true. Everything she had been taught about Veltar values condemned her own behavior. "What do you recommend, General?" "Apologize. Publicly, if necessary. Show the galaxy that tonight was an aberration, not a reflection of our empire's true character. I cannot simply apologize for speaking truth about human limitations." "Princess," General Vexhai said gently, "perhaps the question you should ask is whether you actually spoke the truth or whether you spoke from ignorance and prejudice." After the general signed off, Zarth found herself staring out at the stars again. But now her perspective had fundamentally shifted. The vast expanse that had always seemed like a realm for the Veltar to dominate now looked like a complex web of relationships that she had just damaged, possibly beyond repair. She thought about Commander Chen, probably in his own quarters somewhere on this same station. Was he angry? Hurt? Or was he simply planning how to proceed with his mission despite her interference? More troubling, she found herself wondering what kind of person he really was beneath the diplomatic facade. His file mentioned that he played an ancient human musical instrument called a violin, that he had written poetry that had been published in literary journals, that he maintained correspondence with former students from his time as a visiting professor at the Altarian Military Academy. These were not the details of a primitive warrior, but of a complex individual with depth, creativity, and genuine intellectual curiosity about other species. Someone who might have been interesting to know under different circumstances. Someone she had driven away with her cruelty and arrogance. For the first time in her adult life, Princess Zerth of the Veltar dynasty felt genuinely ashamed of her own behavior. But shame, she was beginning to realize, was just the beginning. The real question was whether there was any way to undo the damage she had done, both to her own reputation and to the diplomatic relationships her father was depending on her to manage. Outside her viewport, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the plans and regrets of mortals. But somewhere among those distant lights were the worlds of the Galactic Council, and on each of them, beings were beginning to form new opinions about humanity, about the Veltar Empire, and about the young princess whose moment of cruelty had revealed truths that could not be taken back. Tomorrow, the real work of diplomacy would begin, and Zerth would have to face the consequences of her choices. But tonight, she could only sit in the darkness and wonder if she had just learned the hardest lesson of her life, that sometimes the people you dismiss are exactly the ones you need the most. The next morning brought no relief for Zerth's growing anxiety. She had barely slept, and when she did manage to doze, her dreams were filled with replay after replay of her encounter with Commander Chun. Each time, she tried to find different words, a different approach, but even in her subconscious mind, the damage seemed irreversible. The formal sessions of the Peace Summit were scheduled to begin at what the station's artificial day cycle designated as morning. Zerth dressed carefully in her formal diplomatic robes, deep purple fabric shot through with silver threads that caught the light when she moved. The garments were designed to project authority and dignity, but as she examined herself in the mirror, she wondered if anyone would see past the previous night's behavior to remember that she was supposed to represent the best of her civilization. The main conference hall was even more impressive than the reception venue had been. Arranged in concentric circles, the seating was designed to accommodate the physical requirements of dozens of species while maintaining the diplomatic protocol that governed intergalactic relations. The innermost circle was reserved for the senior delegates, emperors, presidents, and other heads of state who attended virtually through holographic projection. The second circle contained their direct representatives, including Zerth. The outer circles held advisors, observers, and younger delegates like Commander Chun. As beings filed into the hall, Zerth noticed the subtle changes in behavior that her actions had triggered. Several delegations that had previously acknowledged her with formal respect now offered only the minimum courtesies required by protocol. Conversations seemed to quiet when she passed, and she caught fragments of whispered discussions in various languages, many of which included the words human and disgrace. Commander Chun entered the hall with Ambassador Kethvar, and Zerth felt her chest tighten as she saw him for the first time since their encounter. If anything, he looked more composed than he had the night before. His dress uniform was immaculate, and he moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, greeting various delegates with apparent warmth. Several beings seemed to go out of their way to speak with him, and their interactions appeared genuinely friendly. He did not so much as glance in her direction. The morning session focused on trade agreements and resource allocation, topics that normally would have held Zerth's complete attention. The Veltar Empire had significant interests in several mining consortiums, and she had prepared extensively for these discussions. But she found herself distracted, watching Commander Chen's interactions with other delegates. During a break in the formal proceedings, she observed him engaged in animated conversation with Delegate Crixtar of the Andromedian Collective. The insectoid being was known for his xenophobic tendencies and general hostility toward newer council species, yet he appeared to be listening to Commander Chun with genuine interest. Whatever the human was saying, it was clearly making an impression. "Princess," a voice said beside her, and she turned to see Ambassador Yelgoth of the Tau Ceti hegemony. The elderly being's reptilian features were arranged in what passed for a polite expression among his species, but there was something cold in his golden eyes. "I trust you are well this morning." "Quite well, Ambassador. I look forward to our scheduled discussions about the Kepler sector mining rights." "Ah, yes. About that." Yelgoth's tongue flicked out briefly, a sign of discomfort. "The hegemony has decided to postpone those negotiations indefinitely. We feel that recent events have created an atmosphere that is not conducive to productive discussions." The words hit like a physical blow. The Kepler sector agreements represented potential revenues of trillions of credits for the Veltar Empire. Her father had specifically tasked her with securing those deals. Ambassador, surely one's social misunderstanding should not affect matters of mutual economic benefit. Misunderstanding? Yelgotha's voice carried a sharp edge. Princess, you publicly humiliated a fellow delegate and dishonored a species that has earned its place in this council through blood and sacrifice. The hegemony cannot be seen as endorsing such behavior through continued association. Before Zarth could respond, the ambassador had turned away, effectively ending the conversation. Around the hall, she noticed similar patterns. Delegates who had previously sought her attention now seemed to be avoiding her entirely. The afternoon session dealt with military cooperation agreements, and this was where the full impact of her mistake became apparent. Commander Chun had been invited to present a paper on innovative approaches to asymmetric defense, and as he took the podium, the hall fell silent in a way that suggested genuine anticipation. For the first time, Zarth heard him speak at length, and she quickly realized why her father had mentioned his academic credentials. His presentation was masterful, technically sophisticated yet accessible to beings with widely different military philosophies. He discussed human tactical innovations not with boastfulness, but with the analytical precision of a true scholar. The key principle, he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall, is that defensive advantage often lies not in matching your opponent's strengths, but in forcing them to fight in conditions where those strengths become liabilities. During the Battle of Arcturus, human forces were outnumbered 15-1, facing enemies with superior technology and firepower. Victory came not from developing better weapons, but from understanding that the enemy's reliance on overwhelming force made them vulnerable to rapid, coordinated strikes against their supply lines. He displayed tactical diagrams that showed how human forces had used guerrilla warfare techniques adapted for space combat, drawing enemies into trap after trap while avoiding direct confrontation until the optimal moment. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its effectiveness. The broader principle applies beyond military applications, Commander Chun continued. In any competitive situation, understanding your opponent's assumptions about how the conflict should proceed can reveal opportunities they have not considered. Innovation comes not from having better tools, but from using existing tools in ways that others have not imagined. When he finished, the applause was immediate and genuine. Several senior military officers requested copies of his presentation materials, and Zarth could see that the informal conversations beginning around the hall were already incorporating concepts from his talk. But what struck her most was not his expertise, though that was impressive, but the respect he had shown for his enemies in the presentation. He had described Corvin tactical doctrine with admiration, acknowledging the sophistication of their traditional approaches even while explaining how humans had found ways to counter them. There was no mockery, no dismissive commentary about primitive thinking, just professional analysis delivered with the kind of respect that one expert shows to another. It was exactly the kind of respect she had failed to show him. During the next break, Zarth watched as Commander Chun was approached by General Valcor of the Regelian Defense Forces, one of the most respected military strategists in the galaxy. The two engaged in what appeared to be a detailed technical discussion, with the general gesturing animatedly as he asked questions about specific tactical applications. "He is quite impressive, is he not?" a voice said beside her. Zarth turned to see Admiral Tessera of the Centauran Alliance, an elegant humanoid with pale skin and silver hair who commanded one of the galaxy's most advanced fleets. Yes, his presentation was well prepared," Zarth replied carefully. "I have been reading human military history since yesterday," the Admiral continued, her tone conversational but pointed. "Fascinating species. They have a concept called honor in defeat, the idea that how one loses reveals more about character than how one wins. It seems to be fundamental to their military culture." The comment felt like a rebuke, though Admiral Tessera's expression remained neutral. "I was not familiar with that concept," Zarth said. "No? It explains much about last night, I think." Commander Chun could have responded to your comments in several ways. He could have challenged you directly, which would have created a diplomatic incident. He could have listed his accomplishments, which would have embarrassed you publicly. Instead, he chose to withdraw gracefully, avoiding escalation while maintaining his dignity. Very sophisticated for such a young species, do you not think? Before Zarth could answer, the Admiral had moved away to join a growing crowd around Commander Chun. It seemed that everyone wanted to speak with him, to hear his thoughts on various topics, to understand more about this species that had so quickly established itself as a force in galactic affairs. She had intended to marginalize him, to expose his supposed weaknesses. Instead, her attack had highlighted his strengths and drawn attention to his capabilities. Every person who met him now was discovering the same truth she had learned too late. That humanity's representative was exactly the kind of person the Galactic Council needed more of. The evening brought another reception, this one hosted by the Andromedian Collective. Zarth considered not attending, but her responsibilities to her empire required her presence at all official functions. She dressed carefully once again, hoping to project confidence even as her inner certainty continued to crumble. The reception was smaller than the previous night's event, but the atmosphere was noticeably different. Where before the mood had been generally pleasant, now there seemed to be distinct factions forming. Groups clustered around certain delegates while conspicuously avoiding others, and Zarth realized with growing alarm that she was among those being avoided. Commander Chun, by contrast, was clearly the evening's most sought-after guest. She watched from across the room as he engaged in animated conversations with beings from a dozen different species. His manner was relaxed, friendly, and genuinely interested in whatever his companions were saying. He laughed at their jokes, asked thoughtful questions about their cultures, and shared stories that made others laugh in return. This was not the behavior of someone who had been wounded by the previous night's encounter. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying himself more than ever. "You are studying him," a familiar voice observed, and Zarth turned to see General Vexhai approaching with 2 glasses of Veltar wine. "I am observing the social dynamics," she replied, accepting one of the glasses. "Indeed. And what do your observations tell you?" Zarth considered the question carefully. "That I may have underestimated the significance of last night's interaction." "May have." The general's scarred face showed the slightest hint of amusement. "Princess, 3 more delegations have canceled scheduled meetings with our empire today. The Helix Syndicate has withdrawn its application for military technology sharing. And I have heard rumors that several species are considering forming a new trade alliance specifically to exclude civilizations they consider diplomatically immature." The wine suddenly tasted bitter in Zarth's mouth. "That cannot all be because of one conversation. No, it is because of what that conversation revealed about our empire's attitudes and leadership. Princess, you're not just any Veltar citizen. You are the heir to the throne. Your words and actions are taken as representing the official position of our entire civilization." Across the room, she saw Commander Chun demonstrating something with his hands while a group of delegates watched with obvious fascination. Whatever he was explaining, it had their complete attention. "What is he doing?" she asked. General Vexhai followed her gaze. "Explaining human musical notation, I believe." Apparently, several delegates expressed interest in learning about human culture, and he offered to share some of their artistic traditions. Zarth watched as Commander Chun hummed a melody while moving his hands to show the rhythm, then encouraged the other beings to try replicating the pattern. The result was chaotic but clearly enjoyable for everyone involved. She found herself genuinely curious about the music he was sharing, about the culture that had produced both his tactical innovations and his artistic sensibilities. "General," she said quietly, "have I destroyed any possibility of repairing this situation?" "That depends, Princess. Are you prepared to admit that you were wrong?" The word wrong stuck in her throat. She had been taught from childhood that admitting error was a sign of weakness, that royal dignity required maintaining one's position regardless of circumstances. But looking around the reception hall, seeing the damaged relationships and lost opportunities that her pride had created, she began to understand that sometimes strength required exactly the kind of vulnerability she had been trained to avoid. "Yes," she said finally, "I was wrong. About Commander Chun, about humanity, about the appropriate way to treat a fellow delegate. I spoke from ignorance and let prejudice guide my actions." General Vexhai nodded approvingly. "That is the first step, Princess. But the question now is what you intend to do about it. Before Zarth could answer, she noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A group of beings in elaborate robes had entered the hall, and their presence was causing quite a stir among the other attendees. She recognized the distinctive crystalline features of the Zephyrian Collective's leadership, a species so advanced that they rarely participated directly in Galactic Council events, preferring to send observers rather than full delegates. "What are they doing here?" she asked. "I believe they came to meet Commander Chun," General Vexhai replied. "The collective apparently wishes to invite humanity to participate in their advanced technology exchange program, an honor that has been extended to only 3 other species in the past millennium." Zarth watched as the Zephyrian delegation approached Commander Chun directly. The conversation was brief, but clearly significant, and by the time it ended, every being in the hall was talking about what they had just witnessed. The Zephyrian Collective did not make such offers lightly. Their technology was centuries ahead of most galactic civilizations, and access to their knowledge could transform a species' capabilities overnight. The fact that they had chosen to approach humanity, and had done so publicly, was a clear signal that they considered human civilization worthy of their highest respect. It was also a clear indication of just how badly Zarth had misjudged the species she had tried to humiliate. As the evening wore on, she found herself increasingly isolated, watching from the periphery as Commander Chun continued to impress everyone he met. Her initial plan to expose his weaknesses had backfired so completely that she wondered if there was any way to recover from the damage she had inflicted on her own reputation and her empire's interests. But more than that, she found herself genuinely regretting the lost opportunity to know him as a person. From everything she had observed, Marcus Chun was exactly the kind of being she should want as an ally. Intelligent, principled, innovative, and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that came from genuine confidence rather than bluster. Instead, she had made herself his enemy, and in doing so, had revealed more about her own character than she cared to admit. The reception was winding down when General Vexhai approached her again. "Princess, there is something you should know. Commander Chun will be departing the station tomorrow evening, one day earlier than originally planned." "Why?" "Officially, because he has completed his objectives here and wishes to return to Earth to prepare for the next phase of negotiations." "Unofficially," the general paused, choosing his words carefully. "I believe he has concluded that there is nothing more to be gained from remaining." The implication was clear. Commander Chun had written off any possibility of productive relations with the Veltar Empire, and her behavior was the reason why. As she returned to her quarters that night, Zarth found herself facing a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future relationship between her empire and one of the galaxy's most promising new civilizations. She could maintain her pride, pretend that her actions had been justified, and watch as opportunities slipped away into the darkness between the stars. Or she could find the courage to do what she had never done before, admit her mistakes publicly, and hope that it was not too late to salvage something from the wreckage of her own making. The stars outside her viewport offered no guidance, but somewhere among them was Earth, and on Earth was a civilization that had just learned they could succeed in the galaxy without the Veltar Empire's approval. The question was whether there was still time to convince them that they might want it anyway. Zarth spent the night staring at a blank holographic message screen, trying to find words that could somehow bridge the chasm her own actions had created. How did one apologize for insulting not just an individual, but an entire species? How did one explain behavior that she herself was beginning to find inexplicable? She had drafted 17 different messages before deleting them all. Some were too formal, others too personal. Several read like legal documents designed to limit her liability rather than genuine expressions of regret. None of them captured the growing understanding that her mistake went far beyond diplomatic protocol into questions of basic decency. Dawn arrived with another communication from her father. Emperor Thakron's hologram appeared in her quarters, but this time his expression carried a weariness that she had never seen before. "Daughter, I have been receiving reports throughout the night. The situation has become complex." "How complex?" Zarth asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. The Galactic Trade Consortium has suspended all pending negotiations with our empire pending a review of our diplomatic practices. The Regellian Defense Forces have withdrawn from joint training exercises that were scheduled to begin next month. Most significantly, the Zephyrian Collective has formally requested that we not participate in their upcoming technology summit. Each piece of news felt like another weight added to the growing burden of her consequences. Father, I know I made an error, but surely these responses are disproportionate, are they? The Emperor's voice carried a sharpness that made her flinch. Zara Th, the Zephyrian Collective invited humanity to join their technology exchange program. Do you understand what that means? She did. The collective shared their advanced knowledge only with civilizations they considered to have reached a certain level of ethical and intellectual development. It was a recognition that went far beyond simple technological capability. It was an acknowledgement of worthiness to be trusted with power. The humans achieved in 3 years what some civilizations spend centuries working toward, her father continued. And you dismissed them as primitive. You called their lives expendable. In front of witnesses who are now questioning whether the Veltar Empire shares those values. I spoke carelessly, but surely our long history of honorable conduct should outweigh one moment of poor judgment. Should it? Zaratich, you are my heir. When you speak, beings assume you are expressing the fundamental beliefs that will guide our empire when you take the throne. What you have shown them is that our future leadership values pride over wisdom, prejudice over understanding. The Emperor paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer but somehow more serious. There is more. I have been in communication with several allied species leadership. They are concerned about your fitness to rule. The words hit like a physical blow. They question my right to inherit. They question your judgment, your temperament, and your ability to maintain the diplomatic relationships that our empire depends on. Some have suggested that I should consider naming your cousin Kethvar as my successor instead. The possibility of losing her inheritance had never occurred to Zarth. She had been raised from birth to believe that the throne was her birthright, that her education and training were simply preparation for an inevitable future. The idea that her own actions could threaten that future was almost incomprehensible. Father, tell me what I must do to repair this damage. I'm not certain it can be repaired, daughter. But if there is any hope, it lies in convincing the galaxy that what they witnessed was an aberration, not a true representation of who you are or what our empire stands for. After her father's hologram disappeared, Zarth sat in silence for nearly an hour, finally beginning to understand the full magnitude of her situation. This was not just about diplomatic relationships or trade agreements. It was about the fundamental question of who she was as a person and what kind of leader she would become. She had spent her entire life believing that strength meant never backing down, never admitting weakness, never allowing others to see vulnerability. But watching Commander Chen's response to her attack had shown her a different kind of strength. The courage to maintain dignity in the face of undeserved hostility, the wisdom to choose de-escalation over confrontation. For the first time in her life, she began to wonder if everything she had been taught about leadership might be wrong. The morning session of the Peace Summit focused on cultural exchange programs, and Zarth found herself paying attention with an intensity she had never applied to such topics before. Representative after representative spoke about the importance of understanding between species, about the dangers of prejudice, and the benefits of open communication. Commander Chun had been invited to participate in a panel discussion about overcoming cultural barriers in interspecies cooperation. His contributions to the conversation were thoughtful and well-informed, drawing on examples from human history to illustrate points about successful integration of diverse populations. One of the most important lessons humanity learned during our own development, he said during the session, is that initial impressions can be deceiving. Some of our greatest allies were once our enemies, and some of our most valuable innovations came from individuals who were initially dismissed as unimportant. Progress requires the willingness to reconsider our assumptions when new evidence emerges. The word seemed aimed directly at the heart of Zarth's situation, though his tone remained completely professional, and his examples were all drawn from human internal conflicts rather than galactic politics. During the lunch break, she noticed Commander Chen sitting alone in one of the smaller dining areas. reading something on a portable device while he ate. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to speak with him privately before he departed the station. She approached his table slowly, suddenly, aware that her heart was beating faster than normal. "Commander Chun, may I join you?" He looked up from his reading, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then he gestured to an empty chair across from him. "Of course, Your Highness." She sat carefully, noting that he had not actually welcomed her company, merely acknowledged her right to sit wherever she chose. There was a subtle, but significant difference. I believe we need to discuss what happened during our first meeting." "Do we?" His voice was neutral, polite, but somehow final. "I thought your position on humanity was quite clear, Your Highness." "I'm not sure what additional discussion would accomplish." The response was exactly what she had feared. He was not angry. Anger could be worked with, negotiated around, eventually overcome. He was simply done with her, in the way that one might be done with a book that had proven uninteresting. "Commander," I spoke hastily. "I was misinformed about your species' capabilities and achievements." "I see. And now that you have been better informed, your opinion has changed." The question was a trap, though a polite one. If she said yes, she was admitting that her previous statements had been based on ignorance. If she said no, there was no point in continuing the conversation. "Yes," she said quietly. "My opinion has changed significantly." Marcus Chun studied her face for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was analyzing her the way a scientist might examine a particularly interesting specimen. "Your Highness, may I ask you a question?" "Of course. Why does my opinion of this conversation matter to you?" "You are the heir to one of the galaxy's most powerful empires. I represent a species that, as you correctly noted, is quite new to galactic politics. Whether we reach any understanding should be of minimal importance to your future." The question forced her to confront motivations she had not fully acknowledged to herself. "Because I believe I was wrong. About you, about humanity, about the appropriate way to treat a fellow representative of the Galactic Council. I appreciate that admission. But being wrong about someone is not necessarily cause for concern unless you plan to interact with them in the future. Since I will be departing tomorrow, and our species' diplomatic contact will presumably be handled by others, the question of personal understanding between us seems academic." His response was perfectly logical and completely devastating. He was essentially asking why her opinion should matter to him, and she was beginning to realize that she had no good answer. "Commander, is there any possibility of repairing the damage I have caused?" "To galactic politics? That remains to be seen. Several species seem to have formed more positive impressions of humanity as a result of our interaction. So from my government's perspective, the outcome has actually been quite favorable." "That was not what I meant." "No, I suppose it wasn't." He leaned back slightly, still studying her with those analytical eyes. "Your Highness, may I speak frankly?" "Please do." 3 days ago, I came to this station hoping to establish productive relationships with representatives from various civilizations, including yours. I had read about Veltar culture, studied your empire's history, and prepared extensively for our meeting. I was looking forward to learning about your people's achievements and exploring areas where our civilizations might find common ground. Each word felt like a small blade finding its mark. When we met, you made it clear that you considered humanity to be primitive, emotional, and essentially unworthy of respect. You suggested that human lives were expendable, that our military victories were somehow less honorable because they relied on strategy rather than brute force. You did this publicly in front of representatives from dozens of other species. "Commander, I'm not finished." His voice remained calm, but there was something implacable about it now. "Your behavior told me everything I needed to know about the possibility of productive relations between our civilizations under your future leadership. So I chose to focus my efforts on building relationships with species that might prove more compatible with humanity's values and interests." The clinical precision of his analysis was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. He had simply written her off as irrelevant to his mission and moved on to more productive activities. "From a diplomatic perspective," he continued, "your actions have actually been quite helpful. They created sympathy for humanity among several key species and demonstrated the kind of behavior that the galactic community apparently finds unacceptable. The Zephyrian invitation alone makes this trip a significant success for my government. So my mistake benefited you, Zara TH said, beginning to understand just how completely her plan had backfired. Your mistake revealed character, Your Highness. Both yours and, apparently, mine. The galaxy has drawn its own conclusions about which revelation was more favorable. Silence stretched between them for several moments. Finally, Zara TH forced herself to ask the question that had been building throughout their conversation. Is there anything I could do or say that would change your assessment of the situation? Marcus Chun considered this carefully, and, for a moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Your Highness, do you know what I found most troubling about our first conversation? My comments about human limitations? No. What troubled me was that you clearly believed what you were saying. You weren't trying to provoke me or test my reactions. You genuinely saw humanity as inferior and felt entitled to express that view publicly. That suggests a fundamental incompatibility between our worldviews that goes far beyond simple misunderstanding. He paused to take a sip of water, and she noticed that his hands were completely steady. For real change to occur, you would need to examine not just your opinions about humanity, but the entire framework of assumptions that led to those opinions. You would need to question whether strength really means dominance, whether honor really requires putting others down, whether leadership really means never admitting error. The words cut deeper than any insult could have, because they were essentially accurate. He was describing nothing less than a complete reconstruction of her identity and values. That kind of fundamental change is possible, of course, he continued. But it's also rare, difficult, and time-consuming. It requires genuine self-reflection and the willingness to discover things about yourself that you may not like. Most people find it easier to simply rationalize their existing beliefs. And you believe I lack the capability for such change? I have no idea whether you're capable of it, Your Highness. But I'm not going to wait around to find out. There are too many other productive relationships to build, and too many important things that need to be accomplished. The finality in his voice told her that the conversation was over. He was not rejecting the possibility of her growth and change. He was simply choosing not to invest any of his time or energy in encouraging it. I understand, she said quietly, and realized that for the first time in the conversation, she was being completely honest. She did understand. From his perspective, she represented a poor investment of diplomatic effort, a civilization that had revealed itself to be led by someone whose values were incompatible with productive cooperation. Your Highness, he said as she began to rise from the table, and she paused hopefully. For what it's worth, I hope you prove me wrong. The galaxy would benefit from having the Veltar Empire as a force for positive change, rather than an obstacle to progress. But that will require leadership that values wisdom over pride, cooperation over dominance. It was perhaps the kindest dismissal she had ever received, and somehow that made it hurt even more. As she walked away from the table, Zara TH finally understood the true cost of her behavior. She had not just lost a potential ally. She had lost the respect of someone whose opinion she was beginning to realize actually mattered to her. More importantly, she had revealed something about herself that she was not sure she could live with. If Marcus Chun was right, if her attack on humanity had come from fundamental flaws in her character rather than simple ignorance, then becoming the kind of leader her empire needed would require becoming a completely different person. The question was whether she had the courage for that kind of transformation, and whether it was already too late to matter. The final day of the Peace Summit arrived with an atmosphere of subdued tension. Word of Commander Chen's early departure had spread throughout the station, and while no one spoke openly about the reasons, the diplomatic community was skilled at reading between the lines. Conversations carried undertones of speculation, and Zara TH found herself the subject of subtle scrutiny from beings who were clearly reassessing their opinions of the Veltar Empire. She had spent the previous night in deep meditation, a practice her tutors had taught her, but which she had rarely found necessary before. For hours, she had examined her own motivations, her assumptions, and the beliefs that had guided her actions throughout her life. What she had discovered was deeply unsettling. Marcus Chun had been right. Her attack on humanity had not come from simple ignorance. but from a fundamental worldview that ranked civilizations in terms of power and dominance. She had been taught from childhood that the strong ruled the weak, that survival depended on establishing superiority, and that showing respect to lessers was a form of weakness that invited exploitation. But watching the past few days unfold had forced her to confront the possibility that these teachings were not just wrong, but actively destructive. Every species that had distanced themselves from the Veltar Empire had done so not because they feared her strength, but because they had judged her character and found it wanting. The morning session was devoted to closing ceremonies and the formal signing of various agreements that had been negotiated during the summit. Zara sat in her designated seat, watching as alliance after alliance was formalized, trade agreement after trade agreement was signed, none of them involving her empire. The Terran Federation, by contrast, seemed to be signing something with everyone. The Andromedian Collective offered a research partnership in quantum engineering. The Rigelian Defense Forces extended an invitation for joint training exercises. The Altarian Trade Confederation proposed a comprehensive economic cooperation framework. Even species that had historically remained isolated were making overtures to humanity. In 3 days, Commander Chun had accomplished more for his civilization's galactic standing than many diplomats achieved in years of effort. And he had done it not through intimidation or bribery, but simply by demonstrating the kind of character that other beings wanted to be associated with. As the formal proceedings concluded, delegates began to disperse to their various duties and departure preparations. Zara noticed Commander Chen speaking quietly with Ambassador Kethvar near one of the hall's exits. Whatever they were discussing appeared to be winding down, and she realized this might be her last opportunity to say something meaningful before he left the station forever. She approached them carefully, noting how their conversation ceased as she drew near. Both beings turned toward her with expressions of polite attention, though she could detect wariness in their postures. "Commander Chun," she said formally, "I wanted to wish you a safe journey back to Earth." "Thank you, Your Highness. I appreciate the courtesy." The exchange was perfectly proper and completely hollow. Ambassador Kethvar glanced between them, clearly sensing the undercurrents, but wisely choosing to remain silent. "Commander," Zara said, her voice carefully controlled, "I have one final question, if you will permit it." He nodded. If someone truly wished to learn from their mistakes, to become the kind of leader their people deserve rather than the kind they currently are, where would such a person begin? Marcus Chun studied her face for a long moment, and she forced herself to meet his gaze directly. She could see him weighing her words, trying to determine whether this was genuine curiosity or simply another diplomatic maneuver. "Hypothetically," he asked. "Hypothetically, I suppose such a person might begin by spending time among those they have previously dismissed as inferior, not to patronize them or prove their own superiority, but to genuinely learn what those beings have to offer. Service rather than dominance. Listening rather than lecturing." He paused, still watching her expression. They might also need to examine their own empire's history more critically. Not just the glorious victories, but the costs of those victories, the voices that were silenced, the opportunities for cooperation that were lost to the pursuit of dominance. And if such a person discovered that their entire worldview had been flawed, then they would face the same choice every thinking being eventually confronts: continue living according to beliefs they know to be false, or find the courage to build something new. Ambassador Kethvar cleared his throat gently. "Commander, your transport will be departing within the hour." "Of course." "Thank you, Ambassador." Marcus Chun turned back to Zartich. "Your Highness, I hope you find the answers you're looking for." It was a dismissal, but a gentle one. As he walked away, Zartich felt the weight of all her choices settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had come to this summit expecting to represent her empire with pride and authority. Instead, she had revealed fundamental flaws that threatened everything she had been trained to achieve. But for the first time since their initial encounter, she also felt something that might have been hope. Marcus Chin's final words had not been mocking or dismissive. They had been genuinely encouraging, as if he believed that change might actually be possible. The question was whether she had the courage to pursue it. 2 hours later, Zartich stood in the station's observation deck, watching through the massive viewport as various ships departed for their home systems. Commander Chen's transport was a sleek vessel bearing the distinctive markings of the Terran Federation. Not the largest or most impressive ship in the departure queue, but somehow carrying more significance than its size would suggest. "Regrets, Princess?" a familiar voice asked behind her. She turned to see General Vexhai approaching, his scarred face showing more understanding than she had expected. "Many," she admitted. "The capacity for regret is often the beginning of wisdom," he said, joining her at the viewport. "The question is what you intend to do with that regret." "I've been thinking about that." Zara Th watched as Chen's ship cleared the station's traffic control zone and aligned itself for the jump to hyperspace. "General, what do you know about the Veltar refugee assistance programs?" The question clearly surprised him. "Very little, Princess. Such programs exist, but they're considered secondary priorities." "Why do you ask?" "Because I think I need to understand what it means to serve rather than to rule, to help rather than to command." She paused as Chun